Okay, good morning everyone. My name's James. I'm a lecturer in Digital History and Archives at the University of Sussex. My apologies for not being able to make it today. I'll be speaking on the topic of born digital archives and their state of play, something I was asked to do. And my interest in this comes from the fact that before I worked at Sussex, I used to work at the British Library, where I was one of the people who worked on coordinating their personal digital archives program. So those things given to the library, which were as hard disks or as floppy disks or similar. I'll be around during the course of the presentation and shortly afterwards to answer any questions if you have any. So I'll just kick on. So firstly, think about what are born digital archives. So these are archives of documents that were made on a computer and they existed first or only as digital files. And these are important because during the 1990s there is a consolidation that happened around personal computers, around what we call Windows icons, mouse and pointer style interfaces. And this created a boom in the number of people creating documents on computers and catalysed what can be seen as the second major break in the production of the Western manuscript. Now, the first took place in the 17th century, so I'm going to go right back there, where we moved from scribal to print culture. And this left a long trail of scribal thinking that still defines, in many cases, what we perceive to be a manuscript. So, for example, in Peter Beale's excellent book on 17th century scribes, he writes, quote, "Each manuscript is peculiar, it is physically and ontologically unique." Now, the problem with this is that even in 1999, when Beale was writing, this was no longer the case. The born digital manuscript, say a personal letter written using Word 95 on a printing system, did not exist physically and was infinitely reproducible. And this obviously has ramifications for the work of archives and for the work that we do in any period after the 90s, or even during the 90s. As National Archives wrote in their excellent 2017 Digital Archives report, quote, "Until relatively recently, records were tangible, often boxes of papers, photographs and maps. This is no longer the case. Now we have digital records, which not only comprise rich but also intangible bits, data and code." And this, they argue quite rightly, has caused some problems for archives because, to move on, quote, "Archival practice hinges on the tangibility of the physical record and a thoroughly established record-keeping tradition. Digital records are very different. Records are not just documents." Now, I'd argue that for much of the work in historical humanities, this principle also holds. Much of the work there also hinges on the tangibility of the physical record, and we validate work through its use of physical records. And most of what we've done with the digital and historical humanities is to jam it into a physical straitjacket. And this was fine to some extent for digitised documents, but it's becoming increasingly clear in the archive sector, and I think among a few scholars as well, this isn't going to work particularly well for born digital documents. Now, the first reason for this should be obvious. Going back to my initial point, in the last 25 years or so in Britain and worldwide, people have really come to create and organise information in a new way. They've been using computers of various kinds to create lots of documents. So documents created through word processors, PCs, palm tops, web pages, laptops, phones, digital cameras, software and email. All these things are generating documents which are kind of made and created and organised in new ways. The second reason I think that we need to do our digital archives better is because the archive sector has been doing them very well and we need to kind of catch up. By 2001-ish, the archive sector had coined a term to describe these records, born digital records, the phrase I used before. That is, going back to Beale, archives that were not in the first logically unique things. For the archive sector, preservation really has been the major challenge since this time. Born digital archives really complicate existing archival categories. They create new kinds of categories. They demand reconsideration of what is significant. Is a downloads folder significant? Are log files significant? And they don't take up physical space, but they take up digital and server space. And I think this is a small point, but it's important for kind of the archival imagination, how people think about what an archive is. Rows of boxes are the way in which we talk about the size of archives. And that's very hard to do when you've got a hard disk. You can either print everything out and put it in boxes so you understand the size of the archive, or you just have to try and reconceptualize what's going on there. So it's complicating the imagination of what people think an archive is. Broadly speaking, over the years, preservation strategies for the born digital have started to consolidate around emulation. me just move this down. So emulation basically means that you don't have to worry about whether an old document will be readable on a later computer, because instead you preserve the computing operating system on which the old document was openable and make the whole operating system work on a more recent computer. In the world of personal archives, or personal papers as the archive sector insist on calling them, this means that archives are arranging with depositors to give them whole hard disks, and then they are capturing those whole hard disks as a single file. So you take it from that, you make a 2 terabyte file. Now you can do many things with this. You can extract documents from it, but you can also work with the operating system at a system level. For example, you can make that system bootable. And this is because the processes used to capture them use something called digital forensics, which is what is often software originally developed for the police. And so, for example, you can go to Emory University in the United States, you can head to their library, and you can boot up emulations of Salman Rushdie's computers that have been deposited there. In those emulations, you are just inside his computer. You can open his drafts, play his games, look at his screensaver settings, interrogate his software logs, look at his browser history. You can experience what it means to make a document in his software environments. And I should say, some of these things may have been redacted. I know in his case some stuff has been redacted. But in principle, these are all the kind of things you can do within an emulated environment that's been made bootable. But, and this is a big but, very few archives are really set up to do this kind of work, and fewer still have made their Born Digital archives available to researchers. Whilst the web archiving community and the presentation of web archives has really forged ahead, and this is very much thanks to national mandates for the UK collecting the UK web, France, the French web, the Danish web, has made kind of this process really workable. With Born Digital personal papers, things are much more fragmented. And they're primarily being accepted and worked on by large archives. So in the UK context, we've got places like the British Library, which have archives of various poets and scientists, the Wellcome Library, which has a really strong collection of a few bioinformaticians, and Manchester University Library has a wonderful archive, an email archive, of something called the Carcanet Press. But I think it's clear within the archive sector that this kind of this change cannot be ignored. The Keep at the University of Sussex, I'm pleased to report, is investing in this area, is investing in digital forensics and preparing itself for needing to be able to process and preserve and make available these kind of archives. And the National Archives, often seen as the bellwether for the sector, are reconfiguring their whole organisation around capturing and presenting Born Digital archives. Now, the presentation challenges here are not only technological. I should say there are real ethical and legal issues which need to be taken into account. Data protection legislation means that archives must be careful reading rooms things that compromise someone's privacy. And at scale, the thousands of documents on hard disk, plus all those log files and other traces, make this a real headache and does encourage conservatism, which is one of the main reasons why a lot of archives haven't been made available. Thankfully, there are a few researchers who are embracing the decisive shift in A, how documents are created, that is from paper to Born Digital, and B, in how they're conceptualized, that is from documents and in boxes to whole software environments, browser logs, and various other traces, our interactions with computers. The most prominent and significant of these is probably a literary scholar called Matthew Kirschenbaum, who works at the University of Maryland. Who argues in his book, Track Changes, quote, "Gaining access to someone else's computer is like finding a master key to their house with the freedom to open the cabinets, cupboards and desk drawers, to peek at family photo albums, to see what's recently been playing on the stereo or TV, even to sift through what's been left behind in the trash." And to make meaningful these master keys, Kirschenbaum argues that we need to acquire new skills as scholars. Versant in the antiquarian cants of vanished operating systems, file formats and emulators, just as we expect an early modernist doing book history to know something of signatures and collation formulas. Now, I should say there are other voices in this space. Torsten Ries at Ghent has worked on the development of contemporary philosophy and literary ideas through digital forensics. Doug Reside at New York Public Library has worked on theatre. Both these individuals are working with small archives and in actually most cases are working directly with donors. This literary emphasis, I think, is not a surprise. Of those in the historical humanities, they tend to get at contemporary topics first. But there's also demand coming out of history, art history, anthropology, and computer science. And the latter, I think, is actually quite interesting, computer science, because with the release of the Enron email archive in 2004, as a result of the Enron scandal, there was a real kind of demonstration by virtue of that, of the need for access to large-scale born digital archives to understand questions around social hierarchies and things like secrecy. So they've been using the Enron archive to understand how people write in secret ways, and things like business practice. Now, thinking of this workshop, where I think the participants in this workshop can usefully intervene in this space is in this shift from scale to close curation. The main practical benefit of going small is that we can resolve data protection ethical challenges much more easily. So we can eyeball data, we can eyeball everything in a small archive to check whether it has any legal or ethical problems. We can then use that as a platform to observe the research processes that emerge and whether they are different or similar to the research processes that people have been using before when working with archives. And then we can consider perhaps how they might inflect on future and projected use of much larger archives. I will leave it there. Just before I go, I should say that the slides have been circulated. If they haven't, I'll obviously send them round. Do include at the bottom a further reading list, which contains some material which I think, if you're interested in this space, you might find useful. And I look forward to questions. Thank you.